students, in this video I'm going to be talking about carbon and how carbon makes up molecules that make up living things, that make up us. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so in our textbook, this is going to be chapter 4, which is titled Carbon and the Molecular Diversity of Life. So carbon is found in all living things. It is the basis for molecules that make up living things. All living things are made up of molecules based on the element carbon. You know, in the next chapter, we're going to be talking about the 4 groups of molecules that contain carbon that make up living things, like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. But in this chapter, we're just going to focus on carbon and, in general, the nature of carbon and carbon-containing compounds that are responsible for living things. Okay, so how does carbon even get into our cells? How do our cells even make these carbon-containing molecules? How do our cells even obtain carbon? Well, let's focus on the carbon cycle and kind of see the bigger picture on how carbon even gets into our cells or into our bodies. So let's talk about the carbon cycle. Let's start with plants first, though. Okay, so how do plants get carbon? Well, by a process called photosynthesis. Okay, they take carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and in a process called photosynthesis, they take in the carbon dioxide, and with the carbon dioxide, they make sugars. Okay, sugars belong to a group of organic compounds called carbohydrates, okay? And those carbohydrates or sugars are going to be the building blocks of plants, and they're also going to be the food source for plants. So not only are the sugars going to be food, but the building blocks of plants. And so when plants make the sugar as food, they, in a process called respiration, they're going to break down the sugars and they're going to release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So this carbon is recycled. It's brought in by photosynthesis. Plants are going to incorporate the CO2, that carbon in CO2, carbon dioxide, into sugars, and then they break it down in respiration and then return the CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's like this cycle. Okay, but how do we, animals, how do we consumers, how do we get carbon dioxide? We get carbon dioxide by eating plant material and then by eating other consumers that eat the plant material. So that's how we get carbon. We consume other living things. When we respire, we will release the CO2 into the atmosphere, and that CO2 will be absorbed by plants, by photosynthesis. So it's like this cycle that continues on and on. But then also when living things die, they will decompose. And in that decomposition process, CO2 is also released into the atmosphere. All right, so CO2 or carbon is continually being recycled through our ecosystem. So organic chemistry is a study of carbon containing compounds. And in 1953, there were these 2 scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. Actually, Harold Urey, he was like the mentor of Stanley Miller. And they believed that in the laboratory that you could simply produce organic compounds if you could mimic primitive Earth, like what was Earth like billions of years ago, that you could actually make organic compounds that started life. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting experiment that they did. They basically simulated early Earth and they were able to produce simple and some complex organic compounds like amino acids. So on the next slide, here is their little setup. Well, not so little, but it was a kind of a big chemistry setup. And let me just move my head out of the way so you can see what's going on in this picture. Okay, so here you have a chamber, a glass chamber with just water that simulated the ocean, and there's a heat source. Okay, so they believe like primitive Earth, it was very volatile. Primitive Earth, there was a lot of plate tectonic activity, and when you have the Earth's plates moving, you have earthquakes, right? You have volcanic activity, because if you have like plates moving together or submerging. You have lava coming out, and this volcanic activity was releasing a lot of gases into the atmosphere, a lot of heat. Okay, and so this heat source in the ocean is where it all begins. Okay, so here you have boiling water. And this water turns into water vapor, and the water vapor will move through this glass tube in their setup and end up in this next chamber. And in this chamber, they hypothesized that the early atmosphere or primitive atmosphere had several types of gases. You have the water vapor, you have methane gas, you have ammonia, I was going to say amino acids, but ammonia, and then you have hydrogen gas. So this methane gas is the source of that carbon that's going to become incorporated into organic compounds that make living things. Okay? And so in this chamber, they had electrodes, and these electrodes simulated lightning. So when you have all these gases just spewing into the atmosphere from all that volcanic activity, you have all this water vapor, it's very volatile. You have lightning, and lightning is energy. It's going to be energy source that's going to break these bonds that hold these molecules in the atmosphere, and also it's going to be energy to make bonds. So breaking bonds, making bonds, that's what the lightning is going to produce. Okay, and so what they did was, once the lightning sparked through this chamber, they allowed for the gases to cool down, and it became liquid, and the liquid was trapped in this part of their apparatus, and they were able to take a sample. They sampled the liquid that was produced from this chamber. And guess what? They were able to produce very simple amino acids and some complex hydrocarbons. And so just by simulating early Earth with these simple gases, they were able to produce and synthesize simple and complex organic compounds that make living things. So the reason why this experiment is very important is that they were able to copy what early Earth was like, and they were able to produce organic compounds that make up living things. So this is an hypothesis as to maybe how life began on Earth, okay? Because organic compounds is really what living things are made up of. So carbon, what's so special about carbon? Why is carbon the basis for all living things? Carbon has 4 valence electrons. Okay, I'm just gonna draw the four electrons on the outside. And so because it has 4 valence electrons, it can share 4 electrons with 4 other atoms. Okay, it can make 4 covalent bonds with 4 other atoms. And because it can make 4 covalent bonds, it's a really good building block to build upon. It's a building block to build upon. You can add more atoms to it. Okay, it can share 4 covalent bonds. So you have simple methane, you have ethane, ethene. Carbon can form 4 single covalent bonds with other atoms. It can form double bonds with carbon and other atoms. Okay? It can form single and double covalent bonds. And carbon can form covalent bonds with carbon, and you can have a carbon skeleton. Carbon chains can form. So you could have a chain of carbon. You could also have branching of carbon. So here you have a chain, but then you can have a chain here, but then a carbon chain that's branching off from the main chain. Okay, so you can have branching chains of carbon. You could have double bonds of carbon, and then you can have rings of carbon. So these examples right here are what we call hydrocarbons, because they contain just 2 elements. You have hydrogen and carbon, and they are the major components of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, right, that is like gasoline, right? They are going to be burned as a source of energy, because there's a lot of energy that's stored between the carbon and hydrogen bonds. Okay, remember, these are covalent bonds which are very stable, and so they store a lot of energy. Okay, so one of the reasons why it's so important to know that carbon is the basis for all life on our planet is because it's so diverse. It can make chains, it can make branches, it could make double bonds, it can make ring structures. The skeleton, the carbon skeleton, you can really build upon it and make simple to very complex molecules. And you guys will learn that when we go over the next chapter, when we go over organic compounds, like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. You can have very simple building blocks that make these complex organic compounds that make living things, okay? So, you know, in the previous slide, you could see here, these hydrocarbons are very simple, like kind of flat, just like one-dimensional, but really, carbon-containing compounds are three-dimensional, right? Because carbon, like in this carbon chain, when carbon forms bonds, covalent bonds, like 4 covalent bonds, it actually makes a tetrahedron. Okay, tetrahedron is a pyramid shape. So I'm just going to draw a dotted line that shows the backside of this. Okay, so here's carbon in the middle of our pyramid, and in the corner of each pyramid would be a hydrogen atom. So this is showing methane. So methane gas is a nice, beautiful pyramid. Okay, it makes a pyramid shape or tetrahedron. And so these chains are three-dimensional. Okay, again, another reason why carbon is a really good building block. Okay, so let's talk about isomers. Isomers are basically variations of molecules. Like, they have the same number of atoms of the same element, but it's a different structure, hence different properties. I mean, you can think of it this way. Like, if you have, in your classroom, you have 3 Johns, but they all look different, right? So isomers have the same chemical formula, okay, the same formula, but different structure. They have the same number of atoms of each element, so they have formula, same formula, but different structure. For example, pentane. Pentane has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like a pentagon has like 5 sides, right? Pentane is referring to 5 carbons. So it has 5 carbons. So what is its chemical formula? C5, and then it has 12 hydrogens. So that's the chemical, that's the chemical formula or chemical formula of the molecule, but also the structure is going to be different. Okay, for N-pentane, if you look at 2,2-dimethylpropane, that also has 5 carbons, C5. It also has 6, oh my goodness, it also has 12 hydrogens. 2-methylbutane has 5 carbons, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you count it all, it has 12 hydrogen. So they have the same formula, but different structure. And because of the different structure, they're going to have different properties. They're going to do different things. They behave differently. They have different shapes. So like I said, it's like having 3 Johns in the classroom, same formula, but they're very different. Okay, they have different structure, different personalities, different properties. Okay. Oh, actually, one property that these 3 molecules have in common is that they're hydrocarbons, so therefore they're going to be nonpolar, right? Hydrocarbons are nonpolar because in the covalent bonds where the carbon is sharing electrons with the hydrogens, they're shared equally, okay? The electrons are shared equally, so there's no charge, there's no negative charge or positive charge that is on the molecule. Whereas oxygen, right? Oxygen is electronegative, so if you have a molecule with oxygen in it, it's going to be polar. But in the case of hydrocarbons, it's going to be non-polar. So it's important to remember hydrocarbons are non-polar, okay? There's 3 types of isomers. The one that I just basically described in the previous example was structural isomer, where the formula is the same, it's just the structure is different. These are compounds with the same molecular formula. Okay, like this is C4H10. This is also C4H10, but it has different structure, which is going to give it a different property. Okay. And then next you have the geometric isomers. So there's 3 kinds of isomers. The first one was structural, and now we're going to talk about geometric. Geometric is also called cis trans isomers. They have the same formula, but they are different in the arrangement around a double covalent bond. So the double covalent bond is between these two carbons. If you have a group of molecules, a group of atoms, it's a group of atoms that are found on the same side of the double bond, we call that cis. But if the group of atoms are found on opposite sides, across from each other, opposite sides of the double bond, we call that trans, okay? We have the X here, but that X just refers to like a group of atoms. Like let's say that the group of atoms is like maybe an oxygen and a hydrogen, like that. Then if they're on the same side, we say cis. If they're on the opposite side, OH, OH, then we call that trans. Okay, so that's geometric isomer. And then lastly, the third type of isomer is called an enantiomer. You guys, basically enantiomers are molecules that have the same formula, but they're mirror images of each other. And because they're mirror images of each other, the rotation of these groups of atoms around the central carbon atom is different. Rotationally, it's different, and they're gonna have different properties. Believe it or not, like to me, when I look at these two different isomers, I would be like, oh, they look the same, or they are the same. They're not. Your cells would be able to differentiate between these two enantiomers because the rotation, the rotation of these different groups of atoms is different. They are mirror images of each other. All right, the last topic of this video and this chapter are functional groups. Because functional groups are so important because the functional group, when they are attached to the carbon skeleton, they change the property of that carbon skeleton. Let's take, for example, estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. And when you think of estrogen, you should think of female gender characteristics, okay? And then down here, this is an example of testosterone. Testosterone, when you hear the word testosterone, you should think of male gender characteristics, okay? When I look at these two different hormones, okay, these two different hormones, I would think that they look very similar, right? They are very similar. They both have 1, 2, 3, 4. They both have 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon ring structures, okay? Carbon ring structure. And each corner in the ring contains a carbon atom, okay? So you have, I'm just drawing in, filling in the carbons. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon ring structures attached to each other, but bring your eyes to the differences between these two hormones. I see the differences in functional groups. Let me just choose a different color. So in estrogen or estradiol, I have an OH, I have a CH3, and I have another OH. Those are functional groups that make estrogen estrogen, okay? And then down here, I have an O, double bonded O. I have a CH3, I have a CH3, and then I have an OH. Those also are functional groups that make testosterone. It's these functional groups, these group of atoms that completely change the behavior of the molecule as a whole, okay? So estrogen, I said, is the female characteristic. It's going to produce the female gender characteristics, okay? Whereas testosterone, male like gender characteristics. When you look at a female lion, male lion, they physically look different, and then behaviorally they're going to be different as well, okay? So let's talk about the 7 functional groups. On the next slide, I have a typo. It says 6, but it's actually 7. So there's actually 7 functional groups. The first functional group is called the hydroxyl. Hydroxyl. One way to remember this is like the word hydroxyl. Hydroxyl reminds you that there's a hydrogen and an oxygen. Hydrogen and an oxygen. Okay? And all molecules with the hydroxyl group are going to be polar. And you can probably guess why it's polar, right? Because of the electronegative oxygen, okay? So anytime you have a hydroxyl functional group attached to a carbon skeleton, it's going to make that molecule polar, okay? We also say that molecules that contain the hydroxyl group to be alcohols, all right? So this is ethanol, because without the alcohol group or the hydroxyl group, it's ethane, okay? So let me just draw ethane super quick. So this is ethane, which is, sorry for my messy writing, it's C2H6, that's ethane. But if we knock out one of these H's and add an OH functional group, which is the oxygen-hydrogen functional group, then we make that into a polar molecule, because remember, this is just a hydrocarbon, it's nonpolar. We make it into a polar molecule. We're completely changing the property of the molecule as a whole now. It's now polar, and it's what we call an alcohol. And this is specifically ethanol. It went from ethane to ethanol, alcohol. Okay, so anytime you see a molecule name and it ends with all, O-L-S, then, or O-L, all, it's an alcohol. It has a hydroxyl functional group, okay? Next is the carbonyl, okay? Carbonyl is basically just two elements. You have the carbon and oxygen. Carbonyl. I mean, I'm trying to make it so that you can remember it easily, but it's, you know, carbonyl, you got the C, carbon, and then the O for the oxygen. I don't know, okay? Maybe you can memorize it that way. So you have the CO, it's a double bonded, double covalent bond between the carbon and the oxygen. And is this gonna make the carbon skeleton polar? It sure is, okay? Because of that oxygen, there's gonna be a slight negative charge on the oxygen because it's gonna share the electrons unequally with the carbon. Okay, you don't need to remember aldehydes versus ketones. Just be able to identify that the C double bonded to an O is a carbonyl functional group, making that carbon skeleton polar. Okay, and then it looks sort of like a carbonyl, but let's talk about the carboxyl group. The carboxyl group. So you have the carbon, and then you have the oxygen. The hydroxyl, it's like a carbonyl mixed with the hydroxyl group, okay? So this is the C double bonded to the O, but then there's also a hydroxyl group attached to it. All together, we call that a carboxyl group. So the COOH, okay? We don't say CO2H. The reason why we don't say CO2H is because the oxygens are separated, okay? They're bonded to the same carbon, but they're separated. One thing to remember about the carboxyl group, besides the fact that it is making the carbon skeleton polar, one thing you need to remember is that the carboxyl group is acidic. It makes the molecule acidic. So not only does it make the molecule polar, but it also makes the molecule acidic. Okay, this is actually kind of important because, so here, let me just draw it like this. So I have the carboxyl group, okay? And remember how this oxygen sharing electrons with this hydrogen, it's electronegative, so it's gonna like pull the electrons closer to it. When it pulls the electrons closer to it, sometimes this hydrogen is released. Okay, it's released because the electron is pulled so hard towards the oxygen that all you are left, the hydrogen is left with, because the electron is gone, all it's left with is a proton, okay? So sometimes that hydrogen is released and it's a hydrogen ion, it's just a proton because it's left its electron with the oxygen because the oxygen pulls the electron closer to it. So it releases the H+. And I don't know if you guys remember, but in the previous section, we did talk about the nature of acids. What are acids? Acids are substances or chemicals that add H plus, have a higher concentration of H plus in a solution. Okay, so molecules such as that has a carboxyl group is going to release H plus into the solution. And when it releases that H plus into the solution, it makes it more acidic. That's what acids do. Acids release H plus into a solution, increasing the H plus concentration in a solution. So this functional group, the carboxyl group, is not only polar, but it causes the molecule to be acidic because it's adding H plus to a solution. And the reason why it adds H plus to a solution is because this hydroxyl part of the functional group releases the H plus into the solution. I hope I didn't confuse you guys by saying that, but these are the two important characteristics or properties of the carboxyl group. Okay, it makes the molecule polar, and it also makes the molecule acidic because that H is released, increasing the H plus in the solution. It's like releasing it, and then because it's released, H plus concentrations increase in the solution because all of this carboxyl groups are releasing the H plus. Okay, and then the amine group is different. Okay, the amine group is different. It makes the solution more basic. Okay, it makes it more basic. So you have NH2. NH2 is the amino group or the amine group. You have the nitrogen, and then you have the H2 or the two hydrogens. The reason why it's called amino group is because amino acids that make a protein, amino acids, they all have an amine group, the NH2. Okay, so that's why they've called it the amino group or amine group, because amino acids have it. Okay, so they're basic because also the nitrogen is electronegative, so it like pulls electrons toward it, so it actually removes H plus from a solution. It can, the H plus here, it can like bring it in. Okay, it brings it in. Okay, it brings in that proton, and it is now going to be, in this case, sharing electrons with 3 hydrogens. Okay, so here you have, this is the amine group making the molecule not only polar because nitrogen is electronegative, but also basic. So I'm just going to write this down. It makes it polar, and also it makes the molecule basic. So again, remember, that's what functional groups do. They change the property of the molecule from maybe non-polar to polar and basic. And then you have the sulfhydryl group. The sulfhydryl group, it's kind of easy to remember because it has the sulfur, S for sulfur. Hydryl refers to the hydrogen. It's just a sulfur and a hydrogen. And when it's attached to a molecule, we call that molecule a thiol. A thiol. Okay? So this was ethane, right? Ethane had the 2 carbons and the 6 hydrogens, right? C2H6, right? And then when you, oops, sorry, that's supposed to be carbon. And then when you knock out this H and you put in a sulfur and a hydrogen, then it becomes ethane thiol. I think that's how you say it. Ethane thiol. Okay, we went from ethane to an ethane thiol just by adding a sulfhydryl group. And also, ethane is nonpolar, but then a thiol is polar. So this functional group is going to make the molecule also polar. Okay, number 6, okay, because there's only 7. Number 6, the phosphate group, we have 1 phosphorus atom surrounded by 4 oxygen. So this is what it's going to look like. Okay, this is a phosphate group. A phosphate group. You've got the phosphorus in the middle surrounded by 4 oxygens. Obviously, this is going to make the molecule polar because oxygen is electronegative, pulling electrons toward it, giving them negative charges. Okay? So the most important molecule in our cells that contain the phosphate group, I shouldn't say the most important because your DNA has phosphate groups, okay? DNA is very important too. But ATP, that's the molecule that provides energy for your cells. Without ATP, your cells would be dead, okay? They wouldn't be able to do anything. But ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate because it has 3 phosphate groups. 3 phosphate groups, okay? And the energy that is utilized in ATP comes from like the breaking of the bonds between these phosphate groups. But more on that in a different chapter, okay? But for now, all you need to know is that the phosphate group is a functional group that changes the nature of molecules, and in the case, it is going to make the molecule polar or add to its polarity. And yeah, there's like energy that's stored between these phosphate groups that's going to be used to provide energy inside of your cells, okay? And then the last one is the methyl group, which is CH3. CH3, is it going to make the molecule polar, or is it going to keep it nonpolar? It's going to keep it nonpolar, right? Because CH3 is a functional group that is a hydrocarbon, and hydrocarbons are nonpolar, right? And if you have a molecule with a methyl group, it's going to contain the word methyl in there. Let me just go back super duper quick to this example. Where is it? There was one example where it said, oh, I know. It was the isomer one. Okay, like this guy right here. This is 2,2-dimethylpropane because it is propane, but then there are several methyl groups, okay? There's a methyl group here, and then there's a methyl group here. And it's called 2,2 because it's actually attached to carbon number 2. So this is carbon 1, 2, 3. And there's 2 methyl groups. Dimethyl, di means 2. Methyl, so you have 2 methyl functional groups attached to the carbon skeleton, okay? So anytime you have the methyl functional group, the name's going to contain the word methyl in there, okay? Like, for example, this one too. This is called 5-methylcytidine, a component of DNA that has been modified by addition of a methyl group. So you have that methyl group attached to the cytosine. The cytosine, nitrogenous base of DNA, okay? And it's going to keep the molecule nonpolar. Okay, but in this case there is, oh, by the way, this is cytosine, right? What functional group is this? This is the carbonyl, which is going to make it polar. And then what functional group is this one? Amino group, right? The amino group. So this is a great example of a molecule that has 3 functional groups attached to it, okay? All right, I think that's it. That's the end of this presentation. I hope it wasn't too long or too boring. Anyways, have a good rest of your day. Bye.